So yeah, look, just as I mentioned, it's sort of 4 or 5 points that I wanted to cover off today. First one being, I was just going to sort of set the scene with a brief history of renewables in Australia, and then we sort of progress to, the discussion around costs, where we are now, where we see ourselves in the next 3 to 5, and then out to 10 years in terms of costs. Obviously, that's top of mind given the current energy crisis that we continue to go through at the moment, which is obviously the result of a range of global factors and also domestic factors. We'll then progress to a discussion around the different types of renewable energy certificates and a discussion about how the renewable energy target works. And obviously that'll be relevant for those of you who are looking to, to get involved in some of the offset regimes that are out in the market at the moment. We'll talk about green power, offtake arrangements, what do these large scale and small scale certificates look like? And then I think we'll finish the discussion with just a brief overview of how these things called power purchase agreements, these offtake arrangements work. So hopefully that sort of covers off on the main points of interest. So look, let's kick off with a quick excursion into the history of renewables in Australia. Interestingly, it did, the whole discussion around renewables started quite some time ago. I guess straight after World War II, we're going to go back that far, back into the late 40s with the Snowy Hydro scheme. Obviously, that was a bit of a poster project for Australia back in the 50s. And if any of you have been down to the Snowy Mountains, you'll see, the legacy of that in terms of the Snowy Hydro scheme that is up and running now. Solar panels first commercially used back in the 1950s. We have CSIRO to thank for a lot of the initial technology there. Move forward to the 60s and 70s, obviously there was a growing need to develop our own domestic sources of renewables, particularly around the early 70s with the oil crisis that went on. And I'm then going to jump ahead to the mid-1980s, and you get this very interesting School of Photovoltaic and Renewable Energy coming out of the University of New South Wales that achieved some 20% efficiency for solar panel design. And this is one of the big, I guess, limiting factors for technologies like solar, in that, we're still at fairly low efficiencies. And we're going to talk more about solar efficiency a bit further on in the presentation. But whilst back in the 80s and 90s, we were looking at solar efficiency of around about 20%, the intention is to try and get to 30% now. And that's part of some funding initiatives that my organisation, ARENA, is assisting. Whilst on the topic of ARENA, we're doing some work with providing ongoing funding to the University of New South Wales, and this is a proposed $45 million package of assistance to expand what the University of New South Wales is doing right out to 2030, and this is part of this delivery of this so-called 30-30-30 package, and we'll talk more about that in a moment, but it's essentially reaching that all-important 30% efficiency goal at under 30 cents a kilowatt by 2030. I mentioned at the outset some of the renewable energy targets that are currently legislated. So in terms of the history of that, you've got to go back to 2001, where we first had the MRET, or the Mandatory Renewable Energy Target. And the associated legislation, that was the Renewable Energy Electricity Act of 2000. That had a very, very conservative goal at the time of only 2% sourcing the nation's electricity generation from renewables. So really that's not that long ago, really. It's only sort of just over 20 odd years ago. And the intention back then, I think that was the Howard government, was to just source 2%. If you jump forward to 2009, I think that would correspond to the Rudd administration. That RET was then increased such that the target was increased up to 20%. That sort of was broadly equivalent to just over 40,000 gigawatt hours of renewable electricity. 2 years forward from that, 2011, that RET was then split into two different schemes. You've got the large-scale scheme and then the small-scale scheme. The large-scale scheme was obviously, as the name suggests, the scheme for the large liable entities like the retailers, the utilities, and some of the other big liable entities that were interested in offsetting and transacting the large-scale certificates. And then you had the small-scale scheme, which was essentially the purview of the residential market, which involved the transacting of small-scale renewable energy certificates for the installation of, for example, solar on the rooftops of residential properties. Jump forward now to 2022. Of course, with the election of the Labor government quite recently, we have a recently upgraded and revised and indeed augmented nationally determined contribution, or an NDC. This is 43%, obviously a significant uptick from what was previously promulgated by the coalition. So that's a 43% figure on 2005 levels by 2030. If you extrapolate that out to what does that look like in terms of share of renewables in the mix, that's around about an 80% mix. We're currently sitting at around about 30 to 33%, so about a third. So based on these targets, there's a lot of work to do. If we're sitting on around about 33% now, and the intention is to get to just over 80% by 2030, I think Chris Bowen, the new Minister for Energy and Climate Change, suggested that in that short period of time we've got an enormous amount to do, and I think it's undoubtedly good that we've got a firm target now. Investment likes certainty, and the best way to achieve certainty is to publish targets. So obviously a lot of work to do between now and then.
Cameron, can I just kick off the interactive style of this thing by asking a question about how far I've got to. So you mentioned we got to 33% of renewables in the mix at the moment nationally. We're aiming for 80% in 2030. There's a kind of a general kind of approach where we kind of think of the stuff that you do early as being low-hanging fruit. Everyone does the easy stuff first, and then it gets progressively harder to chip away at that. But then that ignores the technology curve and the cost curves potentially coming down. So I guess my question is, what's your take on how hard it's going to be, to get progressively from 33% to 80%? I know it's a big question.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's an appropriate point to talk about that, Richard, because my next point of discussion is to talk about all of these costs. But look, I don't think, we cannot underestimate the amount of work that needs to happen between now and 8 years' time. There's not a lot of time to achieve the rollout. And I'm going to talk about this in the next point, but there's this thing called the Integrated System Plan, the ISP, that the Australian Energy Market Operator, or AEMO, releases every couple of years. We've had the most recent iteration of that document come out very recently, just in June of this year. And that document sets out the required build-out that is going to be needed in terms of transmission, in terms of distribution links, in terms of major projects to enable this rollout of a significant proportion of decentralised renewable energy assets to replace, this smaller pool of centralised thermal assets that are rapidly exiting the grid. So yeah, I think in answer to your question, Richard, it's an enormous task. It's going to require enormous amounts of both private capital and government support. So that really the journey is only just beginning.
Excellent, thank you.
Was there any other queries from the group, Richard, before I move on?
Sorry, no one's put up their hand today, Cameron, so okay. Please move on.
Yep. So yeah, look, I thought I'd move on to the second point. It's sort of, the cost story, both where we are now and what we're looking at in the future. And when I say future, let's have a conversation about 3 to 5 years, and then what does it look like out to 10 years. I mentioned just before this integrated system plan that AEMO's put out, and it talks about this step change scenario. The step change scenario is interesting because previously fairly aggressive or progressive projections of what demand and renewable rollout would look like in the future have been very conservative, but for the first time, really, the step change scenario has broken away from that tradition, and have said, look, in order to get to a decarbonised portfolio of net zero, sort of at or before 2050, we need to do the following things, and so they're talking about, rising from where we are today, sort of 30-odd% to 83% in 2030-31, to 96% by 2040, and then obviously 98%, effectively 100% by 2050. That will obviously entail a massive need for the rollout of firming capacity. When I say firming capacity, that is capacity which is essentially dispatchable. It's better to have a conversation these days about what technologies are truly dispatchable. In other words, what technologies can be delivered on demand as and when required, such as gas, such as some of the pumped hydro and hydro technologies, and in some cases batteries, rather than just focusing on historic discussions around baseload, which is coal, which is rapidly departing the grid. The problem with coal is it doesn't necessarily ramp up and down quickly, whereas other technologies that I just mentioned can do that. So the better discussion now these days is to talk about what is truly dispatchable as opposed to what is baseload. And so if you look at what are the dispatchable storage technologies and capacity that need to roll out to support that massive rollout of renewables, you're looking at about 46 gigawatts, which translates to over 600 gigawatt hours of dispatchable storage. If you break that down into some of the more well-known technologies, that's sort of 7 gigawatts of existing dispatchable hydro, and then almost 10 gigawatts of gas-fired generation. So definitely there is a role for gas, albeit, I think it's fair to say that role for gas will decline over time. But those sorts of dispatchable technologies are the ones that are needed to firm up that rollout of renewables into the future. What discussion about the future of renewables would be complete without a quick excursion into hydrogen? So a lot of hype, a lot of commentary around green hydrogen at the moment, and we at ARENA we're supporting a couple of Australia's first large-scale green electrolyser projects, one in the Pilbara and one down in the Albury-Wodonga area. There is a company called HySATA, HySATA, and that's essentially a spin-off from the University of Wollongong. They're doing some really interesting and groundbreaking work in terms of achieving greater efficiencies with this process of electrolysis. For those of you who don't know, electrolysis is just simply the application of electric current to water, and then you produce a pretty pure stream of hydrogen and oxygen. Where that becomes interesting, but also more costly, is where the electricity for that process is derived from, something like solar PV. So then you get a clean source of energy to produce a clean and green source of hydrogen, which then obviously has a range of different end uses. I mentioned that I'd have a brief discussion about costs. I think, we would all be aware that the cost of renewables, and particularly solar PV and onshore wind, have come down the cost curve quite spectacularly over the last sort of decade or so, to the tune of 80 or 90% in terms of levelized cost of energy. I would encourage you to have a look at, if you're interested in where costs are at the moment, CSIRO produces this thing called a generation or gen cost report, and the most recent gen cost report has got some really, interesting figures in there, which talks about, yes, look, we're currently negotiating a bit of a bump in the overall downward trend because of the global, let's call it the global energy crisis, which is largely the result of, global factors such as the Russian incursion into Ukraine, ongoing problems associated with our coal-fired power stations here in Australia, where many of them are just simply shutting down because they're approaching the end of their life. That has translated into a massive uptick in gas prices here in Australia, which in turn then affects the wholesale price of electricity here in Australia. But in terms of what the CSIRO projects for levelized cost of energy out into the future, you're looking at large-scale solar continuing to fall from where it's sitting at the moment, anywhere between $45 to $65 per megawatt hour, to roughly $27 to $56 per megawatt hour by 2030. So that's really encouraging. It shows that the cost declines for large scale solar will continue, and a similar story for onshore wind. Currently sitting at around sort of $50 to $60 per megawatt hour, but CSIRO is suggesting that that levelized cost of energy for onshore wind will drop down to $40 to $60 per megawatt hour in 2030. So I think all in all, Richard, it's looking pretty good in terms of the cost declines.
Can I ask you a question, maybe to drill into what makes up the costs of electricity generation? So obviously we're kind of used to hearing about the spot market price for electricity in terms of what retailers may need to purchase it for, just to on-sell it. But what's in terms of what makes up the cost for a solar installation versus a coal installation, for example, an existing coal-fired plant? What are the elements of that kind of cost to owners or for provision of that electricity?
So I mean, for an average solar PV plant, I mean, obviously there will be a cost associated with the panels, whether they're polysilicon or whether they're some other sort of material that makes up the panels. But obviously the cost of the panels will be one of the primary sources of cost for a solar PV plant. But then, and this is where where the real cost reductions have been able to be achieved over the last decade, because the cost of creating those wafers and panels from the original polysilicon have definitely been decreasing over time. But I think you also must remember that a very important component of that is the so-called balance of plant. So all of the hardware and the materials that go to enabling a solar PV installation, whether or not it's fixed to the ground or whether it has a two-dimensional tracking system attached to it, they also contribute to the cost. Then there's other things like the approvals and the permits to get these things onto the ground and get them permitted by the relevant licensing or permitting agency. There's there's a range of costs, and all of them are coming down. Some of them are coming down more quickly than others, but obviously it's important that we get both the primary costs associated with panels, but also the balance of plant cost down as well. But I'm pretty confident that those costs, and all of that makes up this so-called levelized cost of energy, the LCOE, which is the truest form of the cost of the technology over the life of that technology. I'm pretty sure that those LCOEs will continue to decline over time.
And then maybe as a follow-up then, so we talk, I think that that levelized cost of supply is a good one. There's a lot of misinformation about the carbon investment, for example, in a wind turbine, and how long it takes for the renewable electricity decarbonisation to offset the carbon it takes to manufacture and install for a wind turbine, for example, or for a photovoltaic array, versus keeping running existing coal and gas. Have you got any kind of insight into the truth or otherwise of some of those claims from different people?
It's a valid point, Richard. I mean, I think what you're referencing here is the true life cycle analysis of these assets. What is the true cost of them, both in terms of carbon consumed to actually build the asset versus carbon ultimately saved once the asset is up and running. I don't have those sorts of figures available to me. I know that there's some very interesting research that's going on, and I think it's something that needs to be done. It needs to have more work in it just to actually understand that better. Related to that also is this whole concept of, what do we do with these solar panels once they've reached the end of their life? Obviously, it makes sense to have a good solid recycling facility such that we're not contributing to the overall waste problem by simply discarding solar panels once they've reached that 20 or 30 odd year end of life point. And I know that there's a lot of interesting work going on with some of the state governments in that space at the moment. So yeah, I think it's a valid point, but I think more analysis is needed to actually truly understand these different differentials in terms of carbon used versus carbon saved over the life of the asset.
I'll do some digging around and see what I can attach with the materials we circulate after this session.
Yeah. So Richard, I think if there's no sort of more queries in terms of the costs of some of these technologies, I might sort of move on now to a discussion about the different types of schemes and targets that are in place, which some of the people on the line might be interested in having a look at. So let's talk first about this renewable energy target here in Australia. And I mean, I've already mentioned that it's bifurcated into the large scale and the small scheme. But in terms of what are the fungible assets that are traded through this, and these are obviously the large scale certificates and the small scale certificates. So if you look at this scheme that is managed by the Clean Energy Regulator by a pretty well administered registry, that scheme is responsible for transacting with large renewable power stations and also the owners of small scale systems, such as what you might have on the roof of your own property, each of which are eligible to create certificates for every megawatt hour of power that you generate. So that's the supply side of the market. And then if you move to wholesale purchase of electricity, such as the electricity retailers, they then buy these certificates to meet their ongoing renewable energy obligations. And so that's the demand side. And obviously you need both the supply and demand side of any market to make it work. Those purchasers then surrender those certificates to the Clean Energy Regulator, and that's set by regulation in terms of percentages that need to be sold each year. So it's updated every year as to what the number is. The number of certificates issued to an individual or business is determined by the amount of electricity generated or displaced by an eligible system, such as a solar PV plant. Eligible systems may include renewable energy power stations, small-scale solar panels, wind and hydro, solar water heaters, and even things like heat pumps. There's obviously a very busy and large secondary market for certificates that does not necessarily involve the regulator. And this obviously includes, financial institutions, traders, agents, installers, and of course that's the market that many of the the law firms present on the call today would be involved in terms of providing an advice and assisting to. So that's the scheme under the renewable energy target. The other scheme I might mention briefly is the National Guarantee of Origin scheme. So this is still in an evolving space, but it's a scheme that is looking at guaranteeing the green credentials of green hydrogen that I mentioned before is currently underway. This is a scheme that is looking to what's being developed in the European Union at the moment. Suffice to say that the Europeans are ahead of us in this space, but we're looking to effectively piggyback on what some of the work that's been done in Europe at the moment. But if you're interested to understand what sort of work is being done to ensure that the asset in question, in this instance, green hydrogen, is truly green and renewable, then I'd encourage you to have a look at the National Guarantee of Origin scheme that's currently underway at the moment. Some of you may not be aware, but in terms of hydrogen, it's not just green hydrogen that can be produced. It's other colours like blue hydrogen, pink from nuclear, blue from fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage. Each have their pros and cons, but importantly, some of the buyers of this hydrogen will only take green hydrogen. They're simply not interested in other forms of hydrogen, such as blue hydrogen. The other scheme, which is probably worth mentioning, I think, Richard, is just the RE100. This is a global corporate leadership initiative the idea there is it's open to, you know, organisations all over the world that are interested in committing to 100% renewables. And look, I think this is an interesting one. I mean, if you have a look at the most recent report from RE100, in terms of what's going on here in Australia, there are some 15 companies that are headquarters in this space. Number of companies that are currently reporting their electricity data to the RE100 initiative. I think the figure is sitting around 74 or 75. They are all using large-scale certificates, the LGCs that I mentioned before, in terms of one of the fungible commodities under the renewable energy target. And in terms of the percentage share of renewable electricity amongst the RE100 members in the market, they're currently sitting at around 13%. So yeah, that's just another scheme that I thought I'd mention, Richard, in terms of the, you know, the global angle for, you know, how some of these different schemes are operating at the moment. But I might just pause there, Richard, and see if there's any queries on those different schemes that I've talked about.
Excellent. So put up your hand if you'd like to just ask for a little bit more detail or some clarification on the coverage so far. And I'll watch you to see. We'll just give a pause for 30 seconds while people get themselves organised. Oh, so I've seen a hand go up, and that's from Bronwyn. So Bronwyn, I'm just going to unmute your mic, and I might show you. I'm going to allow your camera as well, so you should be able to talk to us. Hello, Bronwyn.
Hi. Thank you so much. I think this is really informative so far. Cameron, I was just wondering if you might provide some commentary. You've run through a number of schemes that are operating globally. It would be interesting to know your views in terms of what regulation you see coming down the pipeline in Australia and how it might relate to those different schemes that you've run through.
Yeah, gosh, where do we start, Bronwyn? That's a huge one. We could have an hour on that one. I mean, if you look at the, you know, the legislation underpinning the renewable energy target, you know, that scheme has obviously been very, very successful. So, you know, Australia has already effectively met that target, and so that scheme runs to 2030. But the question is, well, look, what does supporting legislation for that type of scheme look like into the future, given that we've already met that, you know, that target of 20%. Indeed, we've well surpassed it. So, you know, there's obviously different views in the market. I mean, some people are saying, well, look, given the need for a rollout of dispatchable technologies, let's come up with a target which is effectively a renewable storage target to support the rollout of renewables over the next 8 years out to 2030. So I know that there's a lot of discussions on that at the moment. So I think that's one area that might be ripe for regulatory reform, you know, at least insofar as the national electricity, you know, the renewable energy legislation under the renewable energy target is concerned for Australia. The only other sort of point I might make in terms of regulatory reform is there's a lot of discussion at the moment in terms of the national electricity law. So, you know, you might have seen some commentary around the national electricity objective at the moment and the inclusion of an environmental objective, which is really the first time that has ever been considered, you know, in over decades. So that's a really interesting development, because if an environmental objective is included in the national, you know, the national electricity objective, then it begs the question: should a similar environmental objective be also included in the national retail law and the national gas law? You know, I don't have the answer for that at the moment, but this is definitely an evolving space, and I think reflects the current government's desire to embed environmental objectives into some of our national gas, electricity and retail electricity laws. The only other point I might make is that we've got this National Energy Laws Amendment Other Gases Bill that's out for comment at the moment. That's all tied into what does reform of all of these national gas laws and national electricity laws look like in terms of accommodating things like an increasing proportion of green hydrogen into existing gas infrastructure. Very, very early days at the moment, but let's just say that the discussion around what is a quote unquote defined gas at the moment is evolving, and for the first time we're looking at not just methane or natural gas in the form of methane as the relevant gas for consideration, but for the first time we're starting to look at things like what does an increasing proportion of green hydrogen into the gas infrastructure look like. And obviously there's a lot of technical and safety considerations that are built around that, and that's the purpose of the bill that's currently being discussed at the moment.
Yes, a lot there to unpack. Maybe one for future discussion.
Yeah, we could have another session on that one easily.
Thanks for the response.
Thank you. Can I ask you a question too about the general renewable electricity market, or not just the electricity market, but the renewables market generally? We talk about, keep talking about it as a national market and with national targets and national generation. Offsets is an example of perhaps a more global market for certificates and those sorts of things. Do you see, is there anything happening in terms of potentially us buying renewable electricity certificates from the Middle East or from other countries? I don't know why Australia would, given given our renewable energy kind of opportunities. But is there a global market for renewable energy certificates?
There's certainly a global market for carbon offsets, Richard. So I think most people would have heard of the Kyoto Protocol and its successor, the Paris Agreement, which has a very active and functioning global carbon market. So there is absolutely a functioning global carbon market that is in existence. And I think one of the really useful things to come out of the Paris Agreement back at the end of 2015 was to reinvigorate and to revisit the rules around the transacting of international carbon offsets. Under Kyoto, it was these things called certificates under the Clean Development Mechanism, or CDM. We've obviously moved on from that now, but one of the big questions there is, how do we ensure that any transacting of international offsets, such as what might exist under the Paris Agreement today, are sufficiently robust and credible as to be, tradable under Australia's own scheme. And I know there's still ongoing work in that space. Of course, here, if we move domestically, you've got this thing called the Emissions Reduction Fund, the ERF, that was set up during the Abbott government, and that was initially a $2 billion fund to transact in Australian carbon credit units, or ACCUs. That's been a fairly active market that has an implicit price on the price of each ACCU. That has seen a spectacular rise over the course of this year. It's dropped back somewhat now. It sort of started in the $12, $13, $14 per ACCU. It rocketed up earlier this year to $40 or $50. It's back down now to around the mid-30s. So it's a fairly volatile market because there is a lot of trading on it. And part of the problem with that market at the moment is that there's been a number of questions raised about the whether or not some of these projects, such as reforestation and regeneration projects that are one of the approved methodologies under the Emissions Reduction Fund, should really be entitled to the benefit of the carbon revenue arising from those sorts of projects, because really those projects they would have gone ahead in any event. In other words, the obligation not to develop a piece of land, in other words, allow it to naturally regenerate, was effectively already there in legislation anyway. So, why should that project have gone ahead and obtain the benefit of carbon revenue? So obviously that's something which the current federal government has promised to look at, and I know that the former chief scientist, Professor Chubb, is running that very detailed review into the efficacy of the emissions reduction fund and some of the some of the methodologies that are there. So I think, in answer to your question, Richard, yes, there's a very liquid and active international market for carbon offsets. I don't think here in Australia where we would be looking to purchase some sort of renewable energy certificate from the likes of the Middle East, but certainly in the future, I think there is the potential for Australia's carbon market to dovetail with emerging carbon markets offshore. For example, California has a very active and well-functioning carbon market, and of course so does the European Union. So I think the trick, obviously under the Paris Agreement, the trick will be to get all of those different carbon markets around the world to effectively talk to each other.
And kind of possibly a related question is obviously then the movement of renewable energy across international borders. You've talked about hydrogen, for example, and green hydrogen is potentially an exportable fuel source. If we can make green hydrogen, does that give us leads into other green or sustainable fuels? Like, can we make a sustainable natural gas if we can make hydrogen, for example? Can we make a sustainable fuel for, a sustainable diesel or a sustainable liquid fuel or a jet fuel out of these sorts of similar processes? Where is that a progressing field?
Yeah, well, I mean, I definitely. So part of the impetus for these green hydrogen projects is that the commodity that is produced, if it is, for example, turned into green ammonia, then obviously green ammonia has real export potential, and a number of these projects are looking to export the product in the form of green ammonia to very willing and ready buyers across the Southeast Asian region, who may not have the same ability to produce green ammonia to the extent that we can here in Australia. I mean, obviously there's still a lot of questions around the price points for this, but that's part of the reason why we at ARENA are supporting these projects, because we're interested to see what is the price point of this, given that the target for green hydrogen is to get to under $2 a kilo for the hydrogen that's produced. Yeah, look, I think in terms of sustainable fuels, you may have seen that ARENA released earlier on, I think it was late last year, the so-called bioenergy roadmap, and I'd certainly encourage you to have a look at that. And the bioenergy roadmap covers off all sorts of issues around all of the different biofuels. Sustainable aviation fuel is another one. Biomass is another one. So I think, short answer to your question, yes, there's enormous potential for sustainable fuels into the future, but it's something that, given that we only released the bioenergy roadmap last year, I wouldn't really see that getting a lot of traction, at least in terms of support from ARENA, until next year. So it's very early days.
Excellent.
The only other point I might make, Richard, is that I am aware that Germany has recently launched a global green hydrogen product to incentivise imports of green hydrogen. So I think whilst there may be some commentary that Australia is looking to create itself as a global superpower in the green hydrogen export value chain, I certainly would not underestimate what some of the other jurisdictions around the world, such as Germany, are also doing. So I think rather than sort of saying, oh well, Australia is very well positioned to be a leader in this space, I think the better conversation is, well, Australia can obviously do very, very well, but it also needs to keep an eye on what some of the competition is doing as well in this space. So if there's no more queries on that point, Richard, I might sort of move on to a discussion around procuring renewable electricity from retailers. And obviously this is something that, some of the people on the call might be interested in terms of, offsetting opportunities and how do you sort of transition the firm that you're with to a more sustainable, decarbonised platform. I think most people would be aware of this thing called green power. Green power has been around for quite a long time. The nice thing about green power is if you're sourcing your electricity from green power, then obviously it's from a renewable energy source that is effectively government accredited. I think most of the retailers around Australia have a green power accredited product, and you can purchase up to 100% of your electricity from a green power accredited renewable energy source. So that's obviously good news. It's had a lot of success. I think there's more than 25,000 businesses and several 100,000 households are purchasing green power. So there's already a lot of uptake in terms of green power. It's available right across the country. And you just need to align yourself with an accredited green power provider. That's not the only way that you can do it. You can align yourself with a renewable energy developer or a sponsor, and you can elect to purchase some or all of the renewable energy arising from that project, or from a suite of projects across a portfolio, such that your organisation effectively becomes the off-taker. So therefore you can assert your green credentials that way. And of course we've talked about the potential for large-scale generation certificates, the LGCs. You can look to surrender LGCs in respect of eligible large-scale renewable energy plants, and they obviously have a value on the market as well. But yeah, they're sort of the three ways in which law firms could look to establish their green credentials. Green power off-taking arrangements. I know that some of the global law firms are already well down that track in terms of offsetting some or indeed all of their carbon footprint by way of aligning themselves with large renewable energy project developers and therefore taking the benefit of that renewable electricity. So yeah, I think it's an interesting space, and I think it's only going to get more active into the future.
Do you kind of have a bit of a sense of, obviously there's different size law firms on the firms and on the call, and those firms will have different electricity consumptions in terms of spends and kilowatt hours. Do you have a sense of how large a purchase would need to be before it makes sense for firms to kind of investigate and invest in some of these other things, rather than just going to their retailer and purchasing a kind of a retail product like green power?
Look, Sean answer, Richard, I just don't know. I know that some of the really well-known global firms in this space have already aligned themselves with well-known Australian-based renewable energy sponsors, and they are looking to, if they haven't already offset all of their carbon now, they're certainly looking to do so within the next couple of years. But as to what is and I think the question is, do you want to do it just for a particular office, or do you want to do it for all of your Australian offices, or if you're a global, do you want to do it right across your global network? And obviously, I mean, these are discussions you need to have internally, but if you're an Australian firm with multiple offices across Australia, then you obviously need to work out what your consumption is on a per office, and then right across your office network, and then make a decision as to, based on that level of consumption, whether it makes more sense to go 100% offset with one or more big renewable energy sponsors or project developers, or whether you want to do a proportion via green power or something like that.
I imagine there's some additional benefits to those kind of power purchase agreements or off-take kind of projects, apart from just upfront cost. I imagine you get a longer-term potential for a longer-term fixed cost in terms of future purchases, and also aligning yourself with a project, a specific project on the ground.
Multiple benefits. I mean, the big one is obviously it's an effective long-term hedge. So there's the volatility around wholesale electricity prices is not going to go away. If anything, it's going to get worse. So to the extent that you're interested in hedging your exposure over the long term, then obviously these sorts of arrangements are a really nice solution to that. Then, of course, there's all of the green credentials that you get. And, you know, with the increasing focus on ESG, the increasing relevance of ESG in terms of, you know, all of the reporting, particularly that ASX listed companies are looking to have to do in the near future. I mean, ESG is only going to get more important. You know, and you only have to look at what some of the proposed reporting standards under the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, that's out for consultation at the moment. Certainly encourage you to have a look at what's going on under the ISSB. The most relevant domestic equivalent of that might be the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, TCFD. Again, you know, these are all evolving areas of work, but all of them have the overall objective of not only increasing an organisation's exposure to ESG and decarbonisation imperatives, but also increasing the level of disclosure. So yeah, I think, you know, it's an evolving space, but a really interesting one and one to keep an eye on. And there's lots and lots of benefits.
I've just recently become aware of an organisation which packages or splits up power purchase kind of agreements. So it kind of gives you a sort of a middle ground. So if you had a smaller package, they might, for example, contract out to a large generation source and repackage or smaller plots, so you don't actually have to negotiate in a wholesale sense with a electricity generator, but they are sort of an intermediary in that process. Yeah. So
that's right, Richard. Yeah, it's a good point. There's a number of brokers out there. This is what they do. So there's organisations out there that will effectively aggregate organisations that are looking to enter into offset arrangements. You know, and a law firm or a group of law firms might be a candidate for that. And then they'll go to the market, source for you the most appropriate package of solutions, whether it's, you know, projects or whether it's something else, and say, right, you know, to achieve your ESG/decarbonisation objectives, this is what we recommend you do in terms of, you know, the full portfolio of offsetting arrangements. And some of those brokers are very, very good. I've worked with them in the past and they do a very, very good job.
Excellent. And the other bit of information I would just like to add on for the benefit is we are planning a presentation from the administrator of Green Power in Australia, which is a government agency in New South Wales that administers the Green Power program. So that'll be coming up in about 3 weeks' time. So look out for that invitation in your inboxes shortly. So we will be covering off on that Green Power product.
Yeah, great. So unless there's any more queries, Richard, this sort of brings me to my final sort of point for the day. And I was just going to have a brief discussion on the, you know, the potential of power purchase agreements or PPAs. I think most people would be aware of, you know, what a PPA is. It's obviously an agreement to purchase a particular amount of electricity. In this case, it would be renewable electricity over a period of time. I mean, these things, obviously, we talked about the benefits of these things in terms of aligning yourself with ESG goals and hedging your exposure to volatile wholesale electricity prices into the future. In terms of, you know, what is the agreed pricing under a PPA? It can be a fixed price, it can be a floating price, it can be a mixture. The floating price would obviously be indexed against, you know, perhaps a particular price point in the wholesale market. But look, it's just, you know, in terms of the real benefits of PPAs, the nice thing about it is that you get, you know, you are guaranteed long-term delivery of renewable electricity over the long term. So, you know, you're providing a certainty of revenue for the provider of that renewable electricity, but also you get the benefit of having that long-term hedge and also aligning yourself with, you know, what you need to do in terms of ESG and some of your disclosure obligations that you might be looking to sign up to in terms of, you know, touting to the world that you're well and truly on this decarbonisation journey. So yeah, I might sort of leave it there, Richard, in terms of PPAs, but again,
and we are bang on 1 o'clock, so it's a good pause just to say For those people who do need to leave at 1 because they've got other obligations, please feel free to leave. But if you'd like to stay on to ask questions or to contribute to a bit of a conversation about what you might be doing, please stay on the line, and we'll continue on until people have had their questions answered. So, so thanks very much for those who have to leave. Thank you very much. But if anyone has any questions for Cameron on any of the presentation or some left field questions without notice, I'm sure Cameron's already demonstrated that he's not much he doesn't know about the renewable electricity and renewable energy climate in Australia. So see if you can stump him. Let's play Stump Cameron with a question. Any questions?
I think people are keen to get to lunch, Richard.
No, Bronwyn's, yeah, Bronwyn, I think you should be able to unmute your own microphone now. Can you? There you are. Hello.
Cameron, thank you so much. One of the sort of standards, reporting standards that I think might be on people's minds, which I don't think you touched on, is the carbon disclosure project.
Yeah.
Do you want to give us some thoughts on that? And I guess people will be thinking about, you know, how what we're doing will then need to be reported through that mechanism.
Yeah, yeah. I thought the carbon disclosure project was, is it aligned to the RE100 scheme? I thought there was an intersection there. You know, it is.
Oh, sorry.
No, go on.
There's an intersection with a few different reporting standards.
Yes.
And disclosure requirements.
Yeah, yes, that's right. So, I mean, I think to the extent that you want to get involved in something, you know, a global scheme such as RE100, I think that the CDP, it's obviously it's an international global initiative, and it's all about how do organisations effectively measure and then report on what they are doing in terms of decarbonising their value chains. So, you know, the Carbon Disclosure Project is a very, very large scheme. And I confess I'm not an expert on that particular scheme, but, you know, I know that it does form part of the reporting chain under the RE100 scheme. And, you know, if you're looking to align yourself with international best practice as to how do you measure, report and verify your emissions abatement in your organisation, then I would definitely encourage you to have a look at something like this International Carbon Disclosure Project, because I think there's a lot of good work that's going on there. And I know that disclosure project, it's being revised and updated all the time, because this whole business of effectively measuring and reporting and verifying of you know, carbon offsets and emissions abatement, it is always evolving according to the science. So yeah, I think that's a really good suggestion, Bronwyn.
Toby from DLA's just asked a quick question about the opportunity. I think we touched briefly on the opportunity to support renewable energy projects through PPAs or through other sorts of programs, but she's kind of interested, I think, in the intersection between other ESG goals, and she's mentioned reconciliation or homelessness, for example, and how potentially a law firm might manage or perceive of their renewable electricity or renewable energy strategy in terms of ways that it might have collateral benefits outside of purely carbon.
Yeah, well, I guess, you know, if we look at the ESG drivers, then, you know, something like renewable energy and decarbonisation perhaps aligns most closely with the E in the ESG, but, you know, absolutely essential that we keep a very firm eye on the S and the G. There will always need to be a social license, you know, the S part for these sorts of projects. If you take, for example, green hydrogen, I mean, obviously green hydrogen requires enormous amounts of water to power the electrolysis process. And the problem with some of these projects that are building very large electrolyzers is that they are not located near, reliable or easy to access large water supplies, and that begs the question, where do you get the water from? So absolutely these projects need a social license, both upfront and then ongoing, in order to operate effectively and to be to really get that full cross section of stakeholder support, and then governance as well. These projects, in order to be effective, they need a very strong governance system, and we've talked about that today. The regulations and the need for regulatory reform is very real. As is often the way for these sorts of projects, the technology leads the law. So by the time the law is caught up, the technology is well and truly moved on. So, by the time we have, a defensible and robust regulatory system in Australia to deal with, large-scale injection of green hydrogen, for example, the technology probably would have well and truly moved on, in which case we'll need more regulatory reform. So I think, it's good to keep an eye on all three parts of the ESG. The only other point I might make in terms of First Nations is there's a lot of interesting work that is going on at the moment right around the country in terms of, how do renewable energy projects, renewable energy zones, for example, more effectively engage with, relevant First Nations people. That's an evolving piece. There's some very interesting work that's going on at the moment in Western Australia, in the Pilbara region, for example, to more effectively engage with traditional landowners that occupy and own land in the Pilbara. We've been approached at ARENA to see whether we can provide support for that sort of initiative, and that's very much ongoing work for us. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting space, and I think to the extent that something like a piece of land that has been designated for the rollout of renewable energy, such as a renewable energy zone, to the extent that that can effectively engage with First Nations people, then so much the better.
To Toby's question, kind of reminds me of the general kind of political arguments for energy transformation in terms of regional development and an injection of capital, jobs and community into areas that are, that have been left stranded by the collapse of other industries, whether they be, primary industries or whether they be, secondary industrial type things in the region. So, yeah, I'm sure there's a whole lot of kind of collateral benefits that come with investment in and management of renewable energy projects.
Yeah. I mean, social license is key. I know we're doing some research at ARENA at the moment around, what does the social license to operate large-scale solar facilities across Australia, what does that look like? I mean, looking at it at a very simplistic level, I mean, these assets obviously take up large tracts of land in some cases. I mean, you only have to look at what's involved with the proposed Sun Cable project in the Northern Territory, which is proposing to export renewable electricity across to Singapore. It's tens of thousands of kilometres of land that will be used. Thousands of kilometres of land, and that land is obviously owned by people. It's not all Crown land, and so there will inevitably be an intersection between private landowners who have farming interests or other sort of leasehold interests by way of pastoral interests, versus the need of the owner or the developer of the renewable energy asset to put their asset onto the land. So yeah, social license long term is key.
That's an interesting project that the Singapore Link project kind of raises the issue of if we can overcome those kind of technological and economic kind of issues to get electricity from the north coast of Australia to Singapore. Are there other kind of national projects that are potentially achievable off the back of that learning, or why is that going ahead and at the expense of, well, not necessarily at the expense of, but as rather than national type projects of similar scale?
Well, I mean, I think first and foremost, Richard, I mean, you've got to have the sponsors for that project. They've got a vision for that project. It's a very, very ambitious vision, but happily for them, they've achieved a couple of key milestones, such as achieving major project status in terms of the designation, so they can streamline a lot of the approval process. but they've also got financial backing from the likes of Atlassian and Fortescue and others. But it's not just that one. There's obviously the Asian Renewable Energy Hub in WA, which is also another project that has achieved major project status. So it'll be very interesting to see how that project goes, particularly in light of what's been happening recently with the Sun Cable project in the Northern Territory. But then if you look at the ISP, the most recent iteration of the ISP, it has an enormous number of interconnector and intra-connector projects right across the eastern seaboard of Australia. Many of them will serve to link up the various renewable energy zones in each of the states. But most of those projects will need to be delivered if we have any chance at all of achieving those those very aggressive targets of 80% renewables by 2030, which is this 43% emissions reduction objective. So again, have a look at some of those big inter and intra-connector projects, those distribution and transmission projects that the ISP is proposing in its most recent issue that the AEMO is proposing in its most recent issue of the ISP, and that'll give you a flavour of some of the large-scale distribution and transmission projects that need to be rolled out over the next decade, or the next couple of decades.
Excellent. Look, thank you very much, Cameron. So I don't know if you've got any final comments, but most people are having to jump off now and get on with their day. But what I can say is that this has been a really kind of informative session to kind of understand that some of those foundational issues about what the renewable energy sector is that underpins the purchases that law firms will then make to for their own electricity now and in the future. So it's been really really incredible privilege to access some of that information from you, and I'm sure we've just scratched the surface. So I'd love to have you back at a future time to kind of delve into one of these areas in a little bit more detail. I think the issue of the power purchase agreements is a really good one. So thank you very much for your time today on behalf of everyone. I think everyone was really highly stimulated by what they've heard. Thank you.
Great, Richard. Nice to be involved.
Thank you, everyone. And once again, I'll provide this recording. I'll also follow up with Cameron to get any additional resources that we can share with people that might underpin some of the points that you were making.
Sounds great. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Cameron.
Cheers.
Bye for now.